It's go time.
Did Redha Kramdi go too far with his hit on Dru Brown, the quarterback for the Ottawa Red Blacks? The CFL fines McLeod Bethel Thompson for comments he made disparaging the league over its scheduling. Only two teams remain undefeated in the Canadian Football League, the Montreal Alouettes and the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Will either or both be undefeated at the end of the weekend? Welcome everyone to Third Down Gamble with your hosts, Don Charbon and Heath Graham. Shawn Lemon is now, once again, suspended by the Canadian Football League.
I believe the Montreal Alouettes were lucky to have Shawn Lemon for the first 4 games of the season. I was under the impression, or maybe of the opinion, that the suspension should have taken effect right away. It was 3 years in the making to come to this decision. Obviously, the due diligence has been done. So I am in agreement with the suspension taking effect, and frankly, Montreal dodged a bullet and had him be a difference maker in early games this season. They could have been without him altogether.
The Alouettes did, but they have been following the norm of whatever is required, that's what they shall do. They have not played games with this at all. The curious part about all of this was raised way back. If you're Shawn Lemon, this is in the offing. Why aren't you giving some sort of notion of contrition? Look, I did this. I didn't understand it. Look, I did this. I'm sorry. Or something to at least mitigate what could be a continuance. We don't know what's going to happen at the arbitration hearing on August, I believe it is 1st and 2nd. If it doesn't go well, he may be suspended for the season, maybe for life, for all we know, because the CFL has come down very hard on its demand that if you're with the league, nobody bet on CFL.
Absolutely, and I would imagine he's under a bit of a gag order probably from the CFLPA as it goes to arbitration to maybe not publicly plead his case. We'll see what happens when we get to that hearing point. Again, we see gambling infractions by players or people involved with professional sports teams be taken very seriously. It is a different world now than it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago when Pete Rose was suspended and banned from baseball for betting. We see so much revenue and so much publicity and advertising from betting organizations, casinos, online, everything involved. We see the FanDuel pregame show on TSN before the games kick off. It is a different world and a different attitude. So I am hesitant to believe it will be a lifetime suspension. I imagine it will still be hefty, but times are definitely changing and you have to look at all of those facets as well.
Interestingly, the amount of dollars that we're talking about here in terms of what Lemon bet were actually quite minute. It was a 2-game parlay, I believe. $100 Canadian, but the real stickler in all of this was that he was also betting on a game in which he was playing. Now, he bet for the Stampeders. This is where this took place. Yet, it takes this time to find this because you've got to have somebody out him, in a sense. Somehow, some way, somewhere, somebody had to flag and say, wait a minute, that's not allowed. And he has been informed, as had every other player. There are going to be consequences if you do this. Unequivocally, the CFL had sent out not only a dictate, but also had examples. They really spelled it out clearly, what their concerns were, what their expectations were. So Sean Lemon doesn't have a great leg to stand on when he goes to see the arbitrator. But that's why you go to arbitration, because the arbitrator, even though has upheld the CFL suspension, the arbitrator still has every right to take a different course once they meet again. Ryan Dinwiddie has come out and said categorically that when Chad Kelly completes his suspension and all of the requirements built within, that he would be more than welcome to entertaining the idea that he would become the starting quarterback once again in Toronto. Given what happened to Cameron Dukes on the weekend, is that part of the reason why this conversation is coming out now? Because Dukes looked like a real rookie against the Rough Riders.
It was a step back for Cameron Dukes this week, and we'll get into that when we break down the games a little bit later. The coach has to stand by his players to some degree. I understand Ryan Dinwiddie making these comments, given the success they had with Chad Kelly as the starting quarterback last year, minus a playoff game in which it was a bit of a disaster. But all in all, Chad Kelly performed like a starting quarterback, was awarded the Most Outstanding Player award in the season-ending award ceremony. The quality of player is there. The question is the quality of the character of the player. And this is where I'm not 100% sure that Chad Kelly will be reinstated after 9 games. I'm not privy to all of the information, but there are some further requirements involved in ending the suspension, just not necessarily at the 9-game period, but when he has fulfilled his obligations for, I believe it's some counseling and some other programs that he has to undertake. Chad Kelly has still been active on social media, and some of those comments maybe aren't the most mature, and it makes me question whether he's going to be able to fulfill all of these requirements.
Part of the requirement package is that he must attend mandatory counseling sessions conducted by a gender-based violence specialist and undergo an assessment from an independent expert. And if he doesn't complete the sessions and assessments to the CFL satisfaction, discipline won't be modified in his favor. It could be modified in the CFL's favor if you want to look at it that way. But the discipline will be upheld. And I know on Twitter he's put out some interesting stuff, if you want to call it that. He has to start to look in the mirror and ask himself, ultimately, what is it that is required of me, and how am I going to get myself there? Because if I want to play professional football anymore, I have to go through these steps, and I not only just go through the motions, but I have to make sure that this becomes part of my life, that I understand. I don't argue that he has every opportunity to be the starting quarterback. I don't argue that Dinwiddie can say that and believe it.
This is where I mentioned character comes into play, and the Argonauts as an organization have to look at what message they are putting forward. And my question is, if this wasn't the starting quarterback, let's say it was a starting defensive lineman or a wide receiver, would the Argonauts be as compassionate to the player as they are with Chad Kelly at this point, or would they have cut him loose and said it's a character issue and they're moving on? You look at the star quality and the importance of a starting quarterback, and it makes me wonder if that plays into it a little bit.
You can point to any of the 41 professional football teams that exist in North America, and all of them would probably do the same thing that the Argonauts are doing. Quarterback of his stature is really tough to find. And when that person is playing well, then you really want to hold on to them. Ultimately, it's not like they're trying to impede or trying to block the CFL from making sure that this is followed through. But the Argonauts have a vested interest in getting the best product out on the field. If Chad Kelly goes through all of this and succeeds at it, then he has every right to be back out there. The question in everyone's mind is, what if he makes it 3/4 of the way, half the way? Then what? And ultimately, I think that's going to go into the CFL's court, not into the Argonauts' court. If you watched the football game between the Ottawa Red Blacks and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, in that game, in that second quarter, you saw one of the most hellacious hits on a quarterback that we've seen this year. Dru Brown breaks through the pocket, goes towards the first down line. slides and is clocked by Redha Kramdi of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, who dislodges Brown's helmet and leaves him on the ground motionless for a few seconds, but he is woozy as a result of this play. Correctly, he is given a foul. What I find that wasn't done properly was that the foul shouldn't have been 15 for rough play. It should have been 25 for dangerous play and kick him out of the game right then and there. And if the people on the field didn't see it well enough to know what he had done, the guys in the booth had every opportunity to upgrade that, and they failed.
I'm not 100% sure it warranted a disqualification. I'm absolutely in favor of the penalty. There was no question about it. Things happened very fast, and it was an illegal play. It was a senseless play. I don't believe it warrants disqualification. And if we want to talk officiating on field, Tobias Harris was called for a grade 2 spear that the officials missed completely on field, and it was called by the booth as well, and rightfully warranted a 15-yard penalty. Maybe a bit of a redemptive play, but both of those, I think, warranted a 15-yard penalty.
Kramdi led with his helmet and his forearm. Exactly what was he not going to do on that play? He was looking to clock Dru Brown, and he got him good. Now, if I blow through a stop sign and I hit you on the driver's side door, I'm held responsible for the consequences of my decision for blowing through that stop sign. Kramdi had the stop sign. That was the slide, the beginning of the slide. He could pull up. He chose not to. Now, he admitted that he made his mistake. He knows that this looked bad for the team, and he knows that he wants to be better as a result of this. He wants to learn from this. I give him all the credit in the world for that. Still doesn't ameliorate what happened on that play. If you're going to protect the quarterback, if you're going to have player safety as a measure of you want to be held to, then you have to kick him out. And if you allow this to happen, as Dustin Crum said, why slide? Because I'm just exposing myself and I'm vulnerable and I'm at the mercy of the defense. Exactly what message are you sending? Kramdi needed to be tossed or at least follow-up suspension for the next game.
Where do they set the precedent, though? The precedent has not been set yet on any hit to a quarterback that's sliding that has resulted in a disqualification. What has he done that's different than other instances over the past several seasons?
I don't care about precedent. This can stand as its own precedent. This is where you draw the line and say, that's it. We've had enough. And you don't deserve to play if you do it. The message has to be sent for everybody else. Kramdi, the play is over for him. He can't do anything to pull it back. But for the rest, that's a signal that they have to receive. Now, we saw it in later games. Brendan Dozier avoids Jake Mayer as he goes into a slide, and he makes a purposeful move to get out of the way so he doesn't hit him. We see Dexter Lawson of the Hamilton Tiger Cats do the same thing with Vernon Adams Jr. Gets out of the way so he doesn't clock him. So tell me that these guys don't have a chance to figure this out before they lay the hit. Everybody says too much momentum, they can't control it. That's beans. It's a forearm shiver. It's not like he rolled up and went up his chest and got him. That I would have said 15. But he went right at the head. There was no illusion about where he was going. This was not, oops, I've hit the wrong spot.
Yeah, like Big Hill's in front of him, so he's sliding to avoid getting smoked by him, and Kramdi comes in from the side.
McLeod Bethel Thompson has been fined for his comments disparaging the CFL leadership. This pertains to his criticism of the league and the short weeks that go on. My problem with the whole McLeod Bethel Thompson rant was, yeah, it's a 9-team league, but in the NFL, how many of those teams share a stadium? Up here, you've got Toronto that shares a stadium, Hamilton shares a stadium, Ottawa shares a stadium, BC shares a stadium, and so does Saskatchewan.
Winnipeg shares a stadium.
It matters because you've got to juggle two schedules now, one that you have and one that they have. And you've got to, especially when it's soccer, they want the football game to be far enough away so that it doesn't impact the field, and especially at BMO, which is grass and turf woven. That's the only team that has it that way. It's something that they did at the National Stadium in Wales, and I think it's a brilliant idea. That's what every team should do, is have a mix of grass and turf weave together. It's so much better. I think he deserved it. We talked about how the kickers got it for the chipped balls. Well, this is McLeod Bethel-Thompson speaking out, and he took his chances.
He did. I don't have a problem with the fine in this situation either. I was a bit surprised when we were discussing it last week that no fine had been levied as of yet, and it turns out the CFL just took a little bit more time with this one. Of course, they don't disclose the amount of the fine. The kickers were all a pretty minimal fine, I believe $250 range for those guys. We don't know the extent of this one, but it just, at least the league is consistent in issuing these fines for criticizing them. I won't get into the whole discussion about the kickers. That was one that we disagreed on and discussed at length. But this shows the consistency that they are going to continue to issue these sorts of fines.
When you call the league into disrepute, you better have your ducks in a row. And when it's just hyperbole or conjecture, then you're asking for a fine. If it's $250, it's pocket change for these guys. But it's symbolic. And it's also a don't do this again, because there is an escalation in the fine structure. Bethel-Thompson is not one to shy away from commentary. He's a very vocal, a very emotional, and a very strong-willed individual. Not a surprise that he would speak out about something he doesn't like. He took the chance. He got the fine.
Hi, I'm Darren Flutie, and you're listening to the Third Down Gamble podcast.
We start in Regina with our weekly review of the games that were played, with the Rough Riders defeating the Toronto Argonauts 30-23 in a very entertaining game, but a game where the Argonauts give up 5 turnovers.
As I alluded to earlier, it looks like Cameron Dukes took a bit of a step back and looked like an untested quarterback. 19 of 33 for 206 yards and 4 interceptions. It got so bad for Cameron Dukes that we actually had a Nick Arbuckle sighting. He came in relief, went 4 for 6 for 35 yards to close this one out for the Argonauts.
We need that Hinterland Who's Who theme running in the background every time we have a Nick Arbuckle sighting. Shea Patterson got the start and went all the way for the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Definitely showed nerves early in that football game. Once he settled down, he went 15 of 23 for 192 yards, and he actually threw a touchdown pass. First for him as a Rough Rider. The Riders' defense really gave the Argonauts fits. Whether you think of it as defensive line pressure, which they did get some, but the secondary threw a lot of mixed packages towards Cameron Dukes, and he had trouble figuring out what they were doing back there, and often threw the ball where his receiver was up against 3 defenders.
He did. And just to go back to Shea Patterson, he definitely settled down in the second half, played a lot better, looked a lot more comfortable out there. But the defense and special teams really gave him the opportunity to do so as well. This one wasn't won by anything spectacular on offense for either team. It was a defensive effort. Roland Milligan had 2 interceptions. Marcus Sales had 1. Deontay Williams had 1. The Riders' defense was all over the field, making big plays again and again, and that really allowed the offense to chip away and really eke this one out. I'm glad I picked the Rough Riders defense in my fantasy this week. They had a fantastic night for me, so kudos to them and a really, really solid effort all around.
It's the second week in a row that the Rough Riders have taken an interception back to the house. When a defense does that for you, that bodes well. A couple of storylines that were worth watching were also, how would A.J. Ouellette play against his former team? 18 carries for 67 yards. He did a little bit through the air as well. The Argonauts, especially with the loss of Jake Serezna, just didn't have the horses to contain the Rough Riders in that football game. They were already out Flurin or Malade. Now Serezna goes down. That's 2 major cogs in their defensive line. it was going to be a long night for that front four.
There was. Jadarian Grant continues to look great as the special teams return man for the Argonauts. They lost Javon Leake to Edmonton in the offseason, picked up Jadarian Grant. He runs one back for an 84-yard touchdown. So he's firing and has really filled in well in that regard. But you're right, the losses on the defensive line for Toronto has made it a little bit tough for them to kind of get the pressure that they need to in order to steal this one. Kadeem Carey struggled to find yards as well on the ground. 11 carries for 39 yards. So once again, that Rough Riders defense kept the run game in check.
Saskatchewan's run defense right now is the best in the CFL. We move to Friday. The Ottawa Redblacks and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Ottawa going in. It's the first time that Dru Brown had a chance to play his former team in Winnipeg. And the Blue Bombers, of course, trying to avoid going 0-5, which is the last time they did it, I think, was 1998. That's not a bad stat when it's been that long. The Ticats, on the other hand, are 0-5. It's the first time since 2017. A little bit of a shorter duration. Winnipeg does win the game, 25-16, and they went back to 3 yards and a ball of dust to do it.
Chris Streveler gets the start for the injured Zach Collaros in this one. It was not a slinging the ball down the field kind of game in this one, but he was 13 of 21 for 127 yards. This was one on the ground. Winnipeg had over 200 yards rushing in total. Streveler, 13 carries for 79. Brady Oliveira, 23 carries for 129 yards. This has to be a big boost for the Winnipeg offensive line, who was struggling through the first 4 games of the season. They got to go out there and hit some defensive players, open up some holes for these guys running the ball, and this was by far the best performance on both the offensive and defensive lines for Winnipeg so far this season.
One curious thing that was brought up during the broadcast, and I kind of thought it at the same time too, was why was Ottawa so reticent to stop the run? They seemed to be concerned that Streveler was going to take an edge and throw off the run like he had against Calgary. And so they played their defense accordingly. And Winnipeg then just said, thank you, we'll just keep running the football.
And a great example of that is in the second quarter. Winnipeg had an 11-play drive where they marched the ball 70 yards down the field, and all of the plays that gained yardage were running plays. They just rammed it right down Ottawa's throat. The defense for the Red Blacks had no answer. They just let Winnipeg push the ball down the field on the ground and resulted in a touchdown.
It's old-fashioned football. It's stuff that you would have seen in the NFL maybe 30 years ago and the CFL maybe 50 years ago. The Blue Bombers did it. They did it well. The Red Blacks looked outclassed and overmatched, even with the change to Dustin Crum, who provided them a lot more mobility at quarterback. That didn't change their fortunes, and Winnipeg full marks for the victory. They earned it. They deserved it. They go forward, and it looks like Zach Collaros, who was held back from playing in this game because of the injury to his thorax, which I'd never heard of that before. I was thinking this was a Dr. Seuss thing, but I was informed that's the Lorax. The status of Zach Collaros is that he's back on the field. He should be ready to go against the Stampeders, which is always good for the Blue Bombers.
One thing this game did, though, was it built some confidence in having Chris Streveler out there as the quarterback as well. It allows them that second weapon. And another nod to Sergio Castillo, 6 for 6 on field goals, including 2 more of over 50 yards. He nailed a 60-yarder the week before. These are not chip shots for him, and he is making them look easy.
If you want to point across the league to the kickers, they're all doing it. They're all making long field goals. Even Lewis Ward made a long one in that football game as well. The kickers are just on fire this year. Speaking of those Calgary Stampeders, they played in Montreal and gave the Alouettes a lot to be concerned about, but fell short 30-26 when Walter Fletcher runs a big one for a score in the final minute. Fletcher's 31-yard touchdown comes with just 1:12 to go, and at the time I thought maybe he scored too early because now the Stampeders have a chance to come back up the field and do something about it. Jake Mayer throws his first interception of the game, and the Stampeders are stopped at that point. The Stampeders were able to run the ball as well, despite the fact that they were missing their top back.
They were, yes. Unfortunately, Jake Mayer kind of threw that cross-body pass into traffic and was picked off late in the game. It's one that he would certainly like back. The first half, everything went Calgary's way. They scored 16 points in the second quarter alone. This was a big offensive night for Calgary early. Montreal made the necessary adjustments and came out and outscored Calgary 15-0 in the fourth quarter to pull this one out. It was looking like an upset for a lot of the game, but Jake Maier kind of came crashing down a little bit late in the game. That Montreal offense took off. Tyson Philpott continues to be the breakout player of the season. He was targeted 13 times, made 12 catches for 134 yards. Just a phenomenal player. Really outshone in the head-to-head against his brother. Jalen Philpott had 2 rushes for 11 yards and no catches. Tyson definitely won the brother battle in this one.
Montreal chalked up 466 yards of total offense to Calgary's 278. You look at that and you think that the Alouettes are dominating, but it's the Stampeders who capitalize on turnovers, who make things happen in that first half. And had the game been 58 minutes, the Stampeders would have left the field winners. I give them full marks for getting that close because Montreal has proven to be a very tough opponent to anyone they played, hence their 5-0 record.
Absolutely. Montreal has won games by large margins. This is one of the closer ones for them, only pulling this one off by 4 points. Cody Fajardo again with a 374-yard passing night. He has to be the runaway nominee for outstanding player in the East so far this season. And if the vote, I mean, I know we're only 5 weeks in, but if the vote was made today, it's really a toss-up between Vernon Adams Jr. and Cody Fajardo.
You compare that to Jake Maier, 18 of 28 for 106 yards. That's roughly 6 yards a reception. You're seeing this more and more in the Canadian Football League. You've seen it a lot in the NFL, where they're using the pass as a running play. They're just checking to the back or checking to a receiver and getting 5 to 6 yards that way. We finish with the BC Lions going into Hamilton to take on the Tiger Cats. Sadly, I picked the Tiger Cats in the big upset thinking that they were due. Well, they wore their pajamas out in the field and apparently didn't wake up until halftime, and the Lions crushed them. And the score flatters the Ticats, a 44-28 win for BC in a game where Vernon Adams Jr. just lit them up.
He did. The Lions defense gave up a late touchdown to kind of narrow the gap a little bit, but BC put up 14 points in the first quarter, 20 in the second quarter, kind of took the third quarter off a little bit, and then matched Hamilton with a touchdown apiece in the fourth quarter. Vernon Adams had an outstanding night, as did his receivers, Hollins and McInnes, once again, standouts on that receiving core for the Lions.
Alexander Hollins had 6 receptions for 116 yards. Justin McInnes did so much in the first 7 minutes of the game, wound up with 10 receptions for 144 yards. The Lions looked dominant.
One other standout player on that BC Lions offense was William Stanback. He had 156 combined yards between receiving and rushing. The Lions are doing a great job of getting him involved in that offense. For Hamilton, because they were behind so much, it forced Bo Levi Mitchell to throw. He was 32 for 48, 374 yards and 3 touchdowns. So you look at those numbers and think maybe it wasn't a bad night, but they were really not competitive in this one at all, and BC just blew them out of the water.
It surprised me because I thought for sure that Hamilton was going to do something to get the crowd into it, and they just, by the time they had their second possession, they were down 7. By the time they had their third possession, they were down 14. It just looked like they were not ready to play that football game, especially on defense. And does this raise into question Mark Washington at all and his defensive coordinating? Because the Ticats are dead last in points allowed, and not by a close margin, by a big margin. They are struggling. It's not the offense. The offense is putting up 20 to 30 points a game, but when you're giving up 44, you're not going to win many.
It is something to consider, certainly. The defense needs to be a lot better. We have seen a bit of a resurgence for Bo Levi Mitchell. I don't think he's the same quarterback he was 5 or 6 years ago, but certainly seems to have recovered fairly well from his injuries. He is getting a little bit up there in age for a quarterback as well, but to continue to put up these 300-plus yard games shows that there is still a lot left in the tank.
Third down.
a second straight road game. There are 3 of them this week, but it does impact your ability to get rest and to get ready. We start week 6 in the CFL with the Toronto Argonauts taking their road show to Montreal to face the Alouettes. The Alouettes, of course, the lone undefeated team in the East on a, if you include playoffs, 13-game undefeated string. It's the longest in franchise history, and they look dynamite. Now, Marc-Antoine Duquois will not be dressed for the Alouettes this week. Huge hit in their defense, but they managed to find anybody and everybody to move around and fill the void.
Given what we saw from the Argonauts on the road in Saskatchewan last week, I do like Montreal at home. 6.5 is a pretty big spread, but other than Calgary keeping it close last week, we have seen the Alouettes dominate, especially at home. Marc-Antoine Duquois is a big loss on that defense. He is so fast and so dynamic in that defensive secondary. But I do believe the Alouettes continue to do what they do best. I'm taking Montreal at home, and they will certainly cover the 6.5.
Alouettes are undefeated against the East, obviously, but they're also much more dominant when they play the East. Toronto is in tough. Injuries on that defensive line is going to make it a lot harder for them. How does Cameron Dukes bounce back? We saw him pulled against Saskatchewan last week. Turnovers are going to kill the Argonauts if they have any more of them. Ryan Dinwiddie is a quarterback whisperer. He'll get Dukes ready. I like the Alouettes, though, at home. I can't see, especially now it's a second straight home game, I can't see how they're going to be troubled by the Argonauts this week. Friday night, it's the Calgary Stampeders on the road again as they take on the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, who are now at home for the second straight week.
The 1-4 Blue Bombers are yet again a favorite. They have not been a dog in any game so far this season. They are favored by 2.5 at home. The Stampeders obviously on the road because it is Calgary Stampede week in Calgary, so the rodeo's going on. It has bumped them from their home. Given what we saw of these two teams last week, Calgary gave Montreal a bit of a scare. I think Zach Collaros coming back to the Bombers is going to be the difference maker. And I'm once again taking Winnipeg. I think I've picked them every week so far this season, as have the experts having him the favorites in the games. And we are 1-4. But I do believe Winnipeg at home takes this one by a field goal or more. That's all they need to do to cover the spread.
Calgary defeated Winnipeg back in Calgary a couple weeks ago with an overtime winner from the foot of Rennie Paredes. 2 weeks in a row on the road is always a tough ask. I don't see how the Stampeders can be any better than what they were against Montreal unless Pat Delmonico decides to throw the ball down the field. He just is reticent to let Jake Maier loose and see what he can do. Maybe they don't have a receiver that will take the lid off of a defense, but you're never going to find out by throwing 5-yard dump passes. I like the Blue Bombers at home. Even with Zach Collaros struggling at the beginning of this year, that can't stay forever. He's going to be back. Streveler may not be as available because of that hip pointer he took against Ottawa. Blue Bombers and the spread. Saturday night, and it's the big one of the weekend. It's the Saskatchewan Roughriders taking their 4-0 record against the BC Lions, who are 4-1. It's Goliath versus Goliath early in this season. The Lions, a 6.5-point favorite.
I think the 6.5 comes down to the fact that it's Shea Patterson at the helm for the Riders and not Trevor Harris. Given what we saw from that Lions offense last week, Vernon Adams is unbelievable this year. And there was some concern about there being a bit of a drop-off on offense with some of their weapons gone, and they have certainly not missed a beat on offense. I like the Lions at home on this one. I think 6.5, simply because it's Shea Patterson as the quarterback. We saw last year a similar situation where the Riders went into BC. Mason Fine got the call in that one as the starting quarterback because Harris was out. The Lions won that one at home fairly easily, and I think they do again in this one.
BC this year at home, they've started very slowly in the 2 games that they've played. Against Calgary, they struggled with that huge crowd to get themselves going. and they struggled against the Edmonton Elks as well. And it took a last play field goal for them to defeat the Elks. I don't understand why they're a different animal when they play back at BC Place, but the Lions seem to be pressed a little bit harder. Saskatchewan, this is going to be a massive test for them. They've played decent teams so far, but now here are one of the elite teams they've got to face. And how do you respond? Shea Patterson cannot let the jitters get to him to start this football game, or BC will feast. The Lions, for their part, have to start quicker if they want to pull away and put this game away, as they did against the Hamilton Tiger Cats. This one's a harder one for me to call, but I kind of agree with you. I think Shea Patterson and his inexperience may cost the Rough Riders. I'm going to lean toward the Lions and the spread in this one as well. We finish with the Ottawa Redblacks and the Edmonton Elks. Edmonton at home, favored by 4.5. Edmonton, I think, still under the tutelage of Chris Jones, believes that it's in training camp as they airlift more and more players. They've picked up Sean Oakman, who started the year with the Toronto Argonauts. They've picked up Derek Moncrief, who's been with the Elks before, but recently was a stalwart with the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Eventually, the Elks are going to be a team that we can actually name all the players. Chris Jones seems adamant that that won't happen anytime soon.
4.5 point spread at home seems like a pretty big spread for a team that has yet to win a game this season. We have had the Red Blacks versus Elks games over the last few seasons coming down to, well, somebody's got to win it. And this one, I am going to give the edge to Edmonton, given what we've seen from them this season. Yes, they are winless, but they have lost 3 of those games by a field goal or less. We don't know the full status of Dru Brown at this point. Unlikely to be the starting quarterback, given the hit he took from Redha Kramdi last week. I like the Elks at home. I think it's going to be closer, though. I'm going to take Ottawa to beat the spread, but Edmonton gets their first win of the season.
I think the Ottawa Redblacks are reeling, given what happened to Dru Brown. Dustin Crum played a lot of games last year, but didn't have a great record. He's got to, as does Shea Patterson, he's got to settle down as a quarterback. You can't just pull the ball down every time their first read is covered. You have to stand in there and find your second and your third read before you press the line of scrimmage by running. Ottawa's defense was good against the Blue Bombers. They just got run over, but once they made the adjustments, the second half, they held the Blue Bombers in check. It's their offense that concerns me. Unless they really push the Elks hard, I don't see how they're going to win. The Elks are coming off a bye. Teams coming off a bye are like 7 out of 8 times they win football games. The Elks at home, I can't see how they're not going to win, and I can't see how they're not going to cover.
Third Down Gamble uses the expert resources of the Canadian Football League and 3 Down Nation. For up-to-date, insightful statistics and analysis, please visit cfl.ca and 3downnation.com. The CFL on CBC theme music is used with written permission from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Thank you for listening to our show. Third Down Gamble is hosted on Podbean. Follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ThirdDownGamble. Join us again next time. The Third Down Gamble Podcast. Audio worth watching.